All right, welcome back to All This Math. This is Professor Parker, and we're back doing some more word problems. As you can see, this particular word problem can be found in the description notes underneath of the video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you like the video, and make sure you share these videos far and wide. All right, that's all I ask. All right, so I'm going to read what the problem says. All right, you should read along, but I suggest you read the problem a few times, so you might want to pause the video. All right. Now, the problem reads, at Hansel's orchard, 48 apples can fit in a basket. All right, so I guess people going apple picking or whatever, right? 48 apples can fit in a basket. One day, Mr. Kelvin and some friends pick enough apples to fill 28 baskets. All right, so we got 28. So if they fill the basket, that means that they got 48 apples in a basket, and they did that 28 times. That's a lot of apples, man. It must have been a lot of them. I hope it was a lot of them. But yeah, so because 48 apples can fill or fit in one basket, they filled 28 baskets. Then the problem goes on to say that it takes 8 apples to make a jar of applesauce. So they trying to make applesauce. All right. The question is, how many jars of applesauce can Mr. Kelvin and his people make from those apples? So there's a couple ways I see, initially to do this problem. One thing I would do is this. I would first try to get a little visual with it, right? I might draw a little basket on my paper if I was you. I'm gonna draw a little basket on the board. So this is my basket, right? All right, so this is supposed to be a basket. All right, let's say that's a basket. Now, how many apples can fit in one basket? The max, 48. So we say 48 apples. 48 apples can fit in one basket. All right. Now, on this particular day in question in this problem, they filled up 28 baskets. And it takes 8 apples to make a jar of applesauce. How many jars of applesauce can they make? So the first thing we need to know is how many individual apples did they pick all together. So if there are 48 apples in one basket and they did that 28 times, they did this times 28. That's what they did. 28 baskets. One of these times 28. They did this 28 times. All right. So one basket times 28. So you do 48 times 28. 48 times 28 equals 1,344 apples. That's a lot of apples. Over 1,300 apples. Now, some of the apples they picked from from Hansel's orchard. At Hansel's orchard, they picked 1,344 apples. All right. So now, then we go on to say, okay, well, we're trying to make applesauce now, right? So out of all these apples, it takes 8 apples to make a jar of applesauce. We're not about to sit up here and just subtract 8 and say, okay, subtract 8, that's 1 jar. Subtract another 8, that's another jar. Subtract another 8, that's another jar. Subtract another 8, that's another jar. But that's actually that's division. What I was just describing was called repeated subtraction. But repeated subtraction can actually be simplified by division. All right, so what we want to do is take this amount of apples and divide it up into groups of 8 apples. Because every group of 8 apples can make 1 jar of applesauce. So if we're trying to figure out how many jars of applesauce, what we really got to figure out is how many groups of 8 apples we can get out of this. So whenever you're trying to figure out how many groups of something, of a certain amount of something you can get out of a total amount, that is division. You're doing division. You're trying to divide this up. Think about the words in the language. Division, divide, division, divide, division, divide. You're trying to divide this number up into an equal amount of groups that each have 8 apples in them. That's all we're trying to do. So we got all these apples, and we're trying to make groups of 8, groups of 8, groups of 8, groups of 8, groups of 8. Every group of 8, you take them 8 apples, make a jar of applesauce. You take another group of 8, make a jar of applesauce. Take another group of 8, make a jar of applesauce. But what we want to do is predict altogether how many jars of applesauce can we make. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this and just do division. 1344 divided by 8, because this tells us how many groups of 8 can we get out of 1,344? All right. And when you do the calculation, you get 168. So that means you can get 168 jars of applesauce with that many apples. All right. But keep in mind, how do you know that? You know that because of the way the problem is worded, right? It's asking you how many jars of applesauce can you make, because it takes 8 apples to make 1 jar. So, and I mean, there's other ways to set this up, right? We could have set it up like this. We could have said, all right, we could have set it up like a proportion, because there's a lot of ways to do this, right? There's always multiple options in terms of solving problems in math, right? So we could have did, let me see, apples over jars equals apples over jars. I think this is gonna work. I just came up with this off the top of my head because I already figured out 2 ways to do this problem. I didn't even think about really setting up the actual proportion. So let's say 1344, that's the total amount of apples, and over X, because we don't know how many jars we can get from this many apples, right? But we do know that from 8 apples, we can get 1 jar. So from this total amount of apples, we don't know how many jars we can get. That's what we had to figure out. But we do know that from 8 apples, we can get 1 jar. So this is called a proportion. It's called a proportion when you got one fraction equal to another fraction. And we got a variable right here that we want to solve for, meaning we want to figure out what number goes right here to make this a true statement. So the way you solve this is by doing cross multiplication. So we do this and we do that. So X times 8 is going to be 8X. So I'm going to bring it up here, right? So that's going to be 8X. Then you write your equal sign. 1344 times 1 is 1344, right? Now, how do we solve for X? We got to get rid of that 8. So 8X equals 1344. So we do the opposite operation from this. This is multiplication. 8, not because of the X. The X doesn't represent main multiplication in this context. This is a variable. This is an unknown value that we're going to figure out. When you have a number next to a letter or a variable, that means that there's multiplication taking place. So we do the opposite of multiplication, which is division. So we're going to divide by 8 and divide by 8, which isn't that what we actually ended up doing anyway. So you see, all these methods kind of end up overlapping anyway. And we know that 1344 divided by 8 equals 168. So that's just another way to get 168. So now let's do a third way real quick. Let's do a third way. Because 8 apples makes 1 jar of applesauce, we could actually figure out how many jars of applesauce we could get from each basket, right? Because one basket got 48 apples in it, right? So don't even worry about the fact that they got 28 baskets. We don't even got to worry about all that to get to 1344. We could have first paused right there and said, all right, well, listen, if it's 48 apples in one basket and it's 8 apples to make 1 jar of applesauce, then we can say, well, how many jars of applesauce can we get off of one basket? Again, how many jars of applesauce can we get off of one basket? You would just take 48 and divide that into groups of 8. So the question becomes, how many groups of 8 apples can I get from 48 apples? How many groups of 8 apples can I get from 48 apples? All I got to do is 48 divided by 8. 48 divided by 8 equals 6, right? So that means I get 6 jars off each basket. So each basket is going to give me 6 jars, right? But I picked, what's his name? Mr. Kelvin and his homeboys, they picked 28 baskets. So if I get 6 jars off one basket, that means all I got to do is do 6 times 28 to get the total amount of jars. Because there's 6 jars in every basket. 6 jars in one basket. 12 jars off 2 baskets. 18 jars off 3 baskets, because 6 times 3. 4 baskets, that's 6 times 4. 24 jars off 4 baskets, and so on and so forth. But instead of me counting by 6s like I'm doing now, I could just do 6 times 28. So we got 6 times 28. 6 times 20 is 120. 6 times 8 is 48. 120 and 48 is still 168. So we just did this problem in 3 different ways, but we wouldn't be able to do it unless we were able to read and comprehend the information in the problem. All right? We got to be able to read the information in the problem and then kind of think about like what the information is telling us. And then from there, we figure out how to do the math and what math is we're being asked to do. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, so we did it like this with a proportion. We got 168. We did it where we calculated the total number of apples and then broke those apples up into equal groups of 8 to get 168. And then we figured out how many jars of applesauce we can get off a basket, off one basket. We can get 6 jars off one basket. And then we just say, okay, well, 6 jars off one basket. If we got 28 baskets, all we got to do is 6 times 28. And either way, we get 168. Either way. And that's the beauty of math. Having options and having different ways to do problems, because we never get locked in. You never want to get locked into just one way of doing a problem, even if you have a preferable way of doing a problem. But you still want to have the ability to kind of have some leeway so you can maneuver a little bit just in case you need to. You know what I'm saying? So yeah. So if anything wasn't really clear, feel free. Just rewind the video, run it back. This video is not even that long. It's like 11 minutes. But yeah, just run it back until it makes sense. All right. Get some practice on some problems like these. Ask your teacher or professor or whoever for some problems like these so you can get some practice and master this skill. It's not enough just to watch the video. You got to practice on your own. All right. So get some practice and I will see y'all on the next video. Peace.